The Belly Pot Cafe was a haven of luxury and exclusivity, with dark wood paneling and deep red velvet curtains that muffled the city's noise. The polished marble tables gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and waiters glided through the space with practiced precision, catering to every whim of their high-end clientele. That morning, the cafe was busier than usual, with smiles and discreet toasts filling the air. It was the perfect setting for a celebration. David Sullivan adjusted his silver cufflinks and cast a satisfied glance around. This was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, and he couldn't wait to share the moment with his best friend, Leo. They had grown up together, sharing dreams and stumbles until they finally reached the success they had always envisioned. Today was supposed to be the day when they sealed a deal that would change their lives forever. As David, mentally, reviewed the final clauses of the contract, a waitress approached with hesitant steps. She was young, with green eyes that betrayed a sea of worries. Her simple uniform contrasted with the elegance of the cafe, and the serious expression on her face clashed with the rehearsed smile she wore for other patrons. She gripped her tray tightly, her knuckles white. "Mr. Sullivan?" Her voice was barely a whisper. David looked up, surprised to be addressed in such a manner. He was a busy man, used to being surrounded only by those with important things to say. This unexpected interruption made him frown slightly, but he decided to listen. "Yes? What is it?" The waitress glanced around as if fearing someone might overhear. Then she leaned in closer, and David caught the faint scent of fresh coffee clinging to her clothes. "I know I shouldn't be doing this," she began, her voice trembling with nerves. "But you need to know that you can't close that deal with your friend tomorrow. Please, trust me, something terrible is going to happen." David blinked, incredulous. He let out a short, skeptical laugh, thinking this must be some sort of joke. "Sorry, but who are you? And why do you think I should believe you?" She bit her lip, clearly regretting her boldness, but there was a desperation in her eyes. Something genuine that David couldn't entirely ignore. "My name is Sophie, and I can't explain now, just think about what I said. You still have time to change everything." Before he could ask more questions, Sophie backed away quickly, disappearing into the service area, leaving David alone with his doubts. He shook his trying to brush off the unease. This was supposed to be a crucial, and he couldn't afford to be distracted by superstitions or the words of a stranger. Yet, as he returned to the contract documents, Sophie's warning echoed in his mind. Something terrible is going to happen. That night, David barely slept, his thoughts tangled and restless. The following morning, when the first rays of sunlight filtered through his window, he glanced out the curtain of his modest apartment and noticed a luxury car parked across the street, directly in front of his door. The car's tinted windows were shut tight, preventing him from seeing who might be inside. He frowned, realizing it was an unusual place for such a vehicle. A knot formed in his chest, and David knew that this day would be unlike any other. Sophie's warning replayed in his mind, and what had seemed improbable now began to morph into a real doubt. He had to make a choice: proceed with his plans and trust the best friend he had known all his life, or take a step back and investigate what lay behind the mysterious warning. David couldn't shake the image of the car parked outside his home. He tried to focus on the routine of the morning, brushing his teeth, adjusting his tie, sipping on the strong black coffee that usually jump-started his day. But today, even the familiar bitterness of the brew did little to calm his nerves. He found himself pacing the small living, glancing out the window every few minutes, as if expecting the car to suddenly vanish, or for someone to step out and offer an explanation. By the time he left for the cafe, his mind was swirling with thoughts of Sophie's warning. He wondered if he should mention it to Leo, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. Leo was pragmatic, straightforward. He would laugh off the concerns, dismiss them as nonsense, and urge David to focus on the contract they had worked so hard to finalize. They were on the brink of success, and David didn't want to come across as paranoid. The Belle Epoque Cafe was just beginning to fill with its usual morning crowd. When David arrived, he spotted Leo seated at their usual corner table, a broad grin on his face, already engrossed in the day's financial papers. Leo waved him over with enthusiasm, his movements confident and assured. As always, for a moment, David felt a pang of nostalgia for the days when they had little more than dreams and ambition. But today, they were on the edge of a major break, one that would cement their place among the city's elite. "David, you're late," Leo chided, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "I've already ordered the first round of coffee. Today's the day, my friend. Everything we've worked for, right in our grasp." David forced a smile and sat down, trying to match Leo's energy. But as he did, his eyes wandered across the cafe, half expecting to see Sophie. In the distance, Watching them, instead, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Patrons chatting, waiters bustling, the hum of morning life in full swing. He let out a breath, wondering if he was making too much of a simple encounter with a nervous waitress. Leo, oblivious to David's inner turmoil, continued talking about their plans for the day. He outlined the timeline for signing the contract, the meetings with their new partners, and the prospects of expanding their business. It should have filled David with excitement, but instead, he felt a creeping unease as he listened. Leo, David interrupted suddenly, his voice sounding sharper than he intended. He leaned forward, lowering his tone. Are you sure about this deal? I mean, we've looked at the numbers, but do you think there's anything we might be missing? Leo's smile faltered, replaced by a look of mild confusion. What do you mean, David? We've been through this 100 times. There's no risk, only opportunity. Why the sudden doubts? David hesitated, realizing how strange he must sound. He struggled to find the right words, the memory of Sophie's warning hanging in the air between them. I heard something. Someone said it might not be a good idea, that we should be careful. He cringed internally at how vague it sounded, but he couldn't bring himself to mention so directly. Leo leaned back, raising an eyebrow. He studied David for a moment, then let out a small laugh. David, listen to yourself. You're getting spooked by rumors. This is business, not some conspiracy. Trust me. Once we sign that contract, we'll be laughing about this over a bottle of champagne. David nodded slowly, but the unease in his chest didn't dissipate. Leo's confidence was usually enough to convince him, but this time, he couldn't let go. Of the nagging feeling that something was wrong, he decided to change the subject, letting the conversation flow back to familiar territory. But inside, the questions continued to churn. As the meeting wrapped up, David glanced out the cafe's large front windows, catching sight of the same luxury car parked a block down. Its presence, so close and yet so silent, gnawed at him. He turned to Leo, who was already gathering his things, oblivious to the growing storm in David's mind. Hey, Leo, he said, trying to sound casual. Do you know anything about that car parked out there? It's been around since early this morning. Leo followed David's gaze, but shrugged. Who knows? Probably some wealthy guy from uptown grabbing a quick breakfast. Why? Does it matter? David forced another smile and shook his head. No, I guess not. But as they left the cafe together, heading toward their next meeting, David couldn't help but glance back one last time. The car remained in place, its windows dark and inscrutable. As if watching him, David and Leo stepped out of the cafe, the city buzzing around them. But David couldn't shake the feeling that those tinted windows were hiding more than just shadows. As they made their way down the busy street, Leo kept up a steady stream of chatter, completely unaware of David's distracted glances over his shoulder. Their next destination was a sleek, glass-walled office building just a few blocks away. It was there that the signing was supposed to happen, an event they had dreamed about during late nights over cheap beers and big plans. But as they reached the building's entrance, David paused, his hand hesitating on the glass door handle. Hey, give me a minute, will you? He said, forcing a casual tone. I think I left something back at the cafe. Leo glanced at his watch, impatience flashing across his face, but he managed to shrug. All right, but hurry up. You don't want to miss this. We've got a lot riding on today. David nodded and turned back the way they'd come, his heart pounding. As soon as he was out of sight, he quickened his pace, weaving through the crowd until he reached the corner where the luxury car was still parked. Up close, the vehicle seemed even more out of place, a sleek black sedan with chrome accents. Its exterior spotless, David felt a chill creep up his spine as he approached, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on him. He walked past the car, glancing casually at the windows, trying to make out anything behind the tint. His curiosity was rewarded when the window on the driver's side lowered an inch, just enough for David to catch a glimpse of a man's silhouette inside. A voice, deep and smooth, spoke from the shadows. Mr. Sullivan, I wouldn't linger. If I were you, not today. David froze mid-step, turning to face the car fully. The voice had a calm, almost soothing quality, but the words sent a jolt of alarm through him. Who are you? David demanded, his voice unsteady. And what do you want? There was a pause, as if the man inside was considering how much to reveal. Then the window lowered a little more, but the man remained hidden in the shadows, his face obscured. Only a faint glint of silver could be seen, perhaps a watch or a ring catching the light. Let's just say I'm someone who believes in being cautious about certain partnerships, the man replied, his tone unsettlingly polite. You should heed the advice you received yesterday. It might save you more than just money. David's mind raced, realizing with a shock that this stranger knew about Sophie's warning. But before he could ask another question, the window slid back up, cutting off any further conversation. The car's engine roared to life, and it pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic with smooth precision. David stood on the sidewalk, dazed and filled with a growing sense of dread. He felt as though he had stumbled into a game where the rules were hidden, and every move he made was being watched. Sophie's warning, the strange man in the car, and Leo's eagerness to push forward with the deal. All these pieces began to twist into a tangled web of uncertainty. He hurried back to the office building, his mind in turmoil. As he entered the lobby, he spotted Leo chatting with their potential partners, all of them laughing and shaking hands as they waited for him. Leo caught David's eye and raised an eyebrow, a silent question that David brushed off with a strained smile. "Sorry about that," David muttered as he joined them. "Let's get this started." They made their way to the conference room, where a series of polished documents awaited their signatures. David took his seat beside Leo, who gave him a reassuring pat on the back, as if to say that everything was as it should be. But David couldn't shake the sense that they were walking into a trap, and with every word spoken around that table, the feeling only grew stronger. The meeting progressed, with the lawyers outlining the final terms and conditions of the contract. David could see Leo's enthusiasm, his unwavering belief in their venture, and it made David feel a pang of guilt. He didn't want to disappoint his friend or cast doubt on their plans, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. When it came time to sign, David hesitated. His pen hovered over the line, and in that brief moment, he saw Sophie's pale face in his mind, her urgent whisper echoing in his thoughts. The room grew silent, all eyes on him, and he could sense Leo tensing beside him. "David?" Leo's voice was low, edged with warning. "What's the holdup?" David looked up, meeting Leo's gaze. His best friend's eyes were filled with impatience, but there was something else too. A flicker of frustration, even anger, that David had never seen before. It sent a chill through him, making him question how well he really knew the man he had trusted for so long. Taking a deep breath, David put the pen down. "I think we need to talk before we sign it." Leo's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he glanced toward the others in the room. The partners exchanged puzzled looks, sensing the sudden tension. "David, this isn't the time for second thoughts," Leo said through gritted teeth. "We're on the verge of closing this." "I know," David replied, his voice steadier than he felt, "but I can't shake the feeling that we might be missing something. Let's step outside for a moment, just the two of us." The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and David could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. But he held his ground, knowing that he couldn't let this unease go unaddressed. With a sharp nod, Leo pushed his chair back, and the two of them left the room, tension crackling between them like a live wire. David's heart pounded as they stepped out into the hallway, knowing that whatever happened next could change everything, for better or for worse. David closed the door behind them, the murmur of voices from the conference room fading into a distant hum. He turned to face Leo, who was already pacing the hallway, his hands clenched into fists. The tension between them felt almost tangible, crackling in the air like a brewing storm. "All right, David," Leo began, his tone sharp, eyes blazing with frustration. "What the hell is going on? Why are you dragging your feet on this? We're so close. Do you realize how much is riding on this deal?" David met his friend's gaze, struggling to find the right words. He knew that whatever he said next could alter the course of their friendship, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt any longer. "Something doesn't feel right, Leo," David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yesterday, a waitress, someone I've never met, came up to me and warned me not to close this deal. And today, there was a man outside watching us saying the same thing. It's too much to ignore." Leo stopped pacing, his expression shifting from frustration to incredulity. For a moment, he simply stared at David, as if struggling to believe what he was hearing. Then he let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're basing this on a waitress's hunch and some guy in a car?" Leo's voice dripped with disbelief. "David, come on. You know how many people try to meddle when they see two guys like us making it big? They're probably just jealous or looking for a way to sabotage us." David shook his head, feeling the frustration rising within it. "It wasn't just a hunch, Leo. It was a warning." She seemed scared, like she knew something. "And the guy this morning, he knew about the warning before I even mentioned it to you. How do you explain that?" Leo's eyes narrowed, a coldness creeping into his expression that David had never seen before. "I don't need to explain it. What I need is for you to focus on what's real. This deal, David, it's everything we've worked for. Are you seriously going to throw it all away because of some random strangers?" David hesitated, glancing down the hallway, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down. He thought of the years they had spent building their business, of the sacrifices and late nights. He knew what this deal meant to Leo, to both of them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of a precipice. and one wrong step could send them plummeting. Look, Leo, I'm not saying we should walk away, David said, trying to find a middle ground. I just think we need to take a step back, look into it a little more, maybe delay the signing for a few days. Make sure everything's on the eye level. But Leo's expression darkened, a vein pulsing at his temple. He took a step closer, and David felt a chill at the change in his demeanor. No, David, you don't get it. There's no stepping back. The partners are expecting our signatures today. If we delay, we lose everything, and I'm not going to let that happen. David's stomach churned with unease at the intensity in Leo's voice. He could see now that there was more to this than just a business deal for his friend. There was desperation, a need that ran deeper than he had realized. He wondered, for the first time, if he had ever truly understood Leo's motives. Why? Leo, why are you so desperate to push this through today? What aren't you telling me? David's voice grew firmer, his own frustration bubbling to the surface. Leo's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with something that almost looked like fear. For a moment, David thought he might finally get the truth, but then, just as quickly, Leo's expression closed off, his face becoming a mask of cold determination. You know what, David? If you can't handle this, maybe you should walk away. But I'm signing that contract today. With or without, David felt the air rush out of his lungs as the words struck. He had never imagined that their partnership could come down to such a stark choice. He stared at Leo, searching for a sign that his friend was bluffing, but found only a wall of stubborn resolve. For a long moment, the hallway was silent, the weight of their unspoken conflict hanging heavy between them. Then, without another word, Leo turned on his heel and strode back toward the conference, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. David watched him go, feeling a knot tighten in his chest as the door closed behind Leo. David leaned against the wall, running a hand through his hair. He felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted, leaving him standing on uncertain terrain. He had thought he knew Leo better than anyone, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that his friend had been hiding something all along. With a deep breath, David made a decision. He wasn't going to follow Leo blindly into that room, not until he got to the bottom of what was really happening. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his recent calls. Until he found the number of the cafe, he dialed quickly, hoping that Sophie might still be working that shift. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice picked up on the other end. Belle Epoque Cafe. How can I help you? Sophie, it's David Sullivan. I need to talk to you now. There was a pause, and when Sophie spoke again, he could hear the tremor in her voice. Mr. Sullivan, I was hoping you'd call. Meet me at the park across the street in 10 minutes, and please, be careful. David's pulse quickened as he ended the call, his mind racing with questions. He glanced back toward the conference room, where Leo's voice could be heard faintly through the closed door. Then he turned and walked briskly toward the exit, feeling the weight of the choice he was making. He had no idea what he would find when he met Sophie, but one thing was certain. He couldn't turn back now. David crossed the street. Thea, sounds of the city blurring into the background as he approached the small park where Sophie had asked to meet. The autumn air was crisp, the trees shedding the last of their golden leaves, and the park seemed almost deserted, except for a few joggers passing by. He spotted Sophie sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree, her posture tense, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. As David neared, she looked up, her face pale and drawn. Her earlier nervousness had transformed into something deeper, an anxiety that made her eyes dart around, as if expecting danger at any moment. David took a seat beside her, the wooden bench creaking under their weight, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you for coming," Sophie finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced over her shoulder before meeting David's gaze. "I wasn't sure if you'd believe me." David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, trying to keep his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I'm here, but you need to start explaining. Who are you, Sophie? Why did you warn me about the deal? And who was that man in the car?" Sophie took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I used to work for them," she began, her voice trembling. "The people behind this deal, they seemed like a legitimate investment group, but they have a way of finding weaknesses in their targets, like a crack in a wall, and exploiting them. I watched them ruin people's lives without blink, but they always covered their tracks too well for anyone to prove." David's brow furrowed. "What does that have to do with Leo? And why come to me?" "Because I think Leo is in trouble, Mr. Sullivan," Sophie replied, her voice urgent. "And I think he's being used. Those people, whoever's behind the contract, they'll take everything from him, from both of you, and by the time you realize what's happened, it'll be too late to stop it." David felt his stomach churn with unease, but he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that Sophie's words rang true. He thought of Leo's desperation, the way his friend's demeanor had shifted over the past few months. Subtle at first, but growing more intense as the deal approached. David had assumed it was just stress, the pressure of reaching the next big milestone, but now he wondered if it was something more. "Do you have any proof?" David asked, trying to rein in his rising panic. "Something I can take to Leo to make him see what's really going on?" Sophie shook her head, her shoulders slumping. "I wish I did, but all I have is what I saw while I worked for them, and they covered their tracks too well. That's why I left. It's why I've been trying to warn anyone I can. But most people don't listen until it's too late." David clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling inside him. He needed more than just warnings and fears. He needed something concrete. Yet, as he sat there listening to Sophie's story, he realized that she had risked everything to speak to him. It would have been easier for her to stay silent, to let him and Leo walk into the trap she believed was set, but she hadn't. He took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. "What do you suggest I do, Sophie? If I confront Leo without proof, he'll never believe me. And if I walk away now, I might never know if you're right." Sophie looked down at her hands, fidgeting with a loose thread on her sleeve. "There's a man, one of their lawyers. He's not as loyal as he pretends to be. He's met with clients who've been hurt by these deals, people who lost everything. He might be willing to talk if you can find him." David's mind raced, trying to process the new information. It felt like grasping at shadows, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. "Where can I find this lawyer?" "He goes by the name Archer," Sophie said, her voice barely more than a breath. "He works out of a small office on the east side, a place where no one would think to look for him. But be careful. If they find out you're talking to him, it could be dangerous." David nodded, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He could see the fear in Sophie's eyes, the genuine concern that had driven her to take such a risk. For a moment, he considered walking away, letting the deal go through, hoping for the best. But he knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to uncover the truth. "Thank you, Sophie," he said quietly. "I appreciate what you've done. More than you know. I'll find this Archer, and I'll try to get to the bottom of this." Sophie managed a faint, grateful smile, but her expression quickly turned serious again. "Just be careful, Mr. Sullivan. These people, they play a different game, one where the stakes are always higher than you think." With those final words, she stood and hurried away, leaving David alone on the bench, his mind reeling with the revelations. He sat there for a moment longer, watching as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows. Across the park, he knew that confronting Leo would be the hardest part, especially without proof, but he also knew he couldn't ignore the warning any longer. David pulled out his phone and found the address of Archer's office, then took a deep breath before heading back into the city. He had a feeling that this search for answers would lead him down a path from which there might be no turning back. David made his way through the winding streets of the east side, the city's pulse shifting from the glossy, high-end atmosphere of the business district to something grittier. The buildings here were older, with faded signs and narrow alleys that seemed to twist into darkness. He clutched the address Sophie had given him in one hand, trying to ignore the growing tension in his chest. After a 20-minute walk, he found the office, a small, nondescript building tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. The sign on the door simply read, "Archer Associates," in peeling gold letters, barely visible beneath a layer of grime. It was a far cry from the luxury office towers David was used to, but he reminded himself that appearances could be deceiving. He stepped inside, a bell jingling softly above the door. The reception area was dimly lit, with dusty furniture and old magazines piled on a coffee table. A secretary's desk stood empty, and the faint hum of radio played a jazz tune somewhere in the back. David took a deep breath and approached the door that led deeper into the office. He knocked twice, the sound echoing in the quiet space. After a moment, a gruff voice called out from inside. "Come in." David pushed the door open and found himself in a cramped office lined with stacks of legal papers and books. Behind a cluttered desk sat a man in his 50s, with thinning gray hair and weary eyes framed by thin glasses. He looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting from annoyance to curiosity when he saw David standing there. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Archer asked, leaning back in his chair. His voice held a note of suspicion, and David couldn't blame it. He must have been an unusual sight in his tailored suit, looking out of place in the rundown office. "My name is David Sullivan," he began, trying to keep his tone steady. "I was told you might have information about a certain investment group, one that's been targeting clients like my partner and me." Archer's gaze sharpened at the mention of the investment group, and he glanced toward the door, as if checking that no one else was listening. Then he gestured for David to sit down. "I'm listening, Mr. Sullivan, but understand this, I don't share what I know lightly. If you're looking for dirt on powerful people, you'd better..." Have a good reason. David took a seat, leaning forward with urgency. I think my partner is being manipulated into signing a deal that could ruin us. A waitress from the Belle Epoque Cafe warned me. Said, you might have insight into what's really going on, please. I need to know what you know. Archer studied David for a long moment, as if weighing the risks of speaking up. Finally, he let out a sigh and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. They call themselves the Vanguard Group, Archer began, his voice low and deliberate. On the surface, they look like any other high-end investment firm, promising big returns and fast growth. But they have a habit of finding people in tough situations, convincing them they're on the brink of a breakthrough, and then using legal loopholes to take everything when things don't go as planned. David felt his stomach drop as Archer's words sank in. You mean they intentionally set people up to fail? Archer nodded grimly. They lure clients with promises, push them to take risks, and when the clients are overextended, they pull the rug out from under them. They have lawyers who are experts in crafting contracts that look airtight but are riddled with clauses that can leave you broke and legally trapped. David's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. He thought of Leo's growing desperation, his insistence on pushing the deal forward, and the strangers who seemed to know more about their situation than they should. He realized with a sinking feeling that Leo might have been caught in their web long before David even noticed the cracks forming. Is there any way to stop them? David asked, his voice edged with desperation. If I can convince my partner to back out, could we still avoid the worst? Archer's expression turned grim. It won't be easy. They have a way of making people feel like they have no choice. And if they think you're a threat to their plans, they won't hesitate to put pressure on, legally or otherwise. David swallowed hard, realizing the implications of Archer's words. He thought of the luxury car, the veiled threat from the man inside, and Sophie's urgent warnings. They were playing a dangerous game, and every move seemed fraught with risk. But despite the fear knotting his stomach, David knew he couldn't back down now. He thought of Leo, his friend who had stood by him through thick and thin, who now seemed like a stranger driven by forces David barely understood. He owed it to Leo and to himself to try to find a way out of this trap. What would you do if you were in my place? David asked, meeting Archer's gaze with determination. Archer leaned back in his chair, regarding David with a mixture of pity and respect. If it were me, I'd gather as much evidence as I could before making a move. Document everything, every conversation, every change in the terms, anything that looks suspicious, and I'd try to get through to your partner before it's too late. Because once they have his signature, it's over. David nodded, his resolve hardened. He stood up, extending a hand to Archer. Thank you. I appreciate your help more than you know. Archer shook his hand firmly, his expression serious. Good luck, Mr. Sullivan, and watch your back. These people don't play fair. David left the office, his mind racing with a newfound sense of purpose. He knew what he had to do, but time was running out. As he stepped back into the cold afternoon air, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the task ahead. He had to find a way to reach Leo before the trap snapped shut completely. But even as he walked back toward the office building where Leo waited, a dark thought lingered in the back of his mind. What if he was already too late? David quickened his pace as he made his way back to the office building, his mind racing through the possibilities. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the skyscrapers, and he couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away with every step. He had hoped to have more time, but Archer's words had made it clear. Every moment counted. As he reached the building's lobby, David took a deep breath and tried to steady his thoughts. He knew that Leo would be waiting for him in the conference room, likely growing more impatient by the minute. David's hands trembled slightly as he pushed open the door to the conference room, bracing himself for the confrontation he knew was coming. Inside, Leo was pacing near the large windows, his silhouette framed against the fading light of the city. The other partners had left, likely sensing the tension, leaving the two of them alone. Leo turned sharply when David entered, his expression a mix of relief and frustration. There you are, Leo snapped, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. What the hell's going on, David? First, you stall the meeting, then you disappear for an hour? We're supposed to be signing this deal today, and you're acting like you've seen a ghost. David closed the door behind him, his pulse quickening. He knew there was no easy way to say what he needed to say, but he also knew he couldn't hold back any longer. I talked to someone, Leo, David began, forcing himself to meet his friend's eyes. A lawyer named Archer. He knows about the people behind this deal, the Vanguard Group. He told me they've been setting you up, using this contract to get you in over your head so they can take everything. For a moment, there was silence. Leo's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something darker. He let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head as if David's words were some kind of joke. You're kidding me, right? David, do you even hear yourself? This is a multi-million-dollar opportunity, And you're spooked by rumors from some washed-up lawyer? Come on, man. We've worked too hard for this. David took a step closer, his frustration spilling over. It's not just rumors, Leo. I've seen how desperate you've been to push this deal through, the late nights, the stress. You've been acting like you're running out of time. What aren't you telling me? Leo's jaw tightened, and for a moment, David thought he might finally get an honest answer. But instead, Leo turned away, his shoulders tense. Don't understand, David. You never do. I'm doing what needs to be done for both of us. If you can't see that, then maybe you're not cut out for this. David felt a surge of anger at the accusation, but he forced himself to stay calm. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small voice recorder, setting it on the table between. This is my proof, Leo, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. I recorded everything Archer told me. He explained how the Vanguard Group operates, how they trap people in bad deals. If you don't believe me, listen for yourself. Leo's eyes flicked to the recorder, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face. For a moment, David thought he might actually reach for it, might finally open up about whatever he was hiding. But then, just as quickly, Leo's expression hardened, and he swept the recorder off the table with a sudden, violent gesture. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, the plastic casing splitting open. You think a cheap trick like this will, change my mind? Leo snapped, his voice rising. I don't need your help, David. I've got this under control. David stared at the broken recorder, a knot tightening in his chest. He had hoped that Leo would see reason, but now it was clear that his friend was too far gone, too deeply entangled in whatever secrets he was keeping. Leo, please, David pleaded, his voice breaking. If you sign that contract today, they'll ruin you. They'll ruin us. I don't want to lose you to this. For a moment, something flickered in Leo's eyes. Regret, or maybe fear. But then he set his jaw and turned back toward the door, his movements stiff with determination. Goodbye, David, he said quietly, his back to his friend. If you can't trust me, then we're done here. With those final words, Leo walked out of the room, leaving David standing alone in the empty conference room, the weight of their shattered partnership pressing down on him. He heard the sound of the door closing with a hollow thud, each footstep echoing through the hallway until it faded into silence. David sank into a chair, his hands trembling as he picked up the pieces of the broken recorder. He felt like a fool, clinging to the hope that he could still save Leo from whatever trap he'd fallen into. But now, as the cold reality set in, he realized that his friend was already too far gone, lost to secrets that David might never fully understand. For a long moment, David sat in the empty room, staring out at the city beyond the windows. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the skyline, and David knew that his world had changed irrevocably. But even as the darkness settled in, one thought burned brightly in his mind. He wasn't done fighting yet. David left the conference room, the echoes of his final conversation with Leo reverberating in his mind. The air outside the building was colder now, the evening breeze cutting through his jacket as he walked aimlessly through the city streets, trying to make sense of what had happened. He had lost Leo, not just as a business partner, but possibly as a friend, someone he had trusted for so long. And now he was alone in his fight against an unseen enemy, but he couldn't dwell on the loss for long. If what Archer had said was true, then time was running out, and David knew he had to act quickly if he wanted any chance of stopping the disaster that seemed to be closing in on them. As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a message from one of the lawyers, or perhaps a follow-up from Sophie. Instead, the screen flashed with an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. David Sullivan, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. A pause crackled through the line, followed by a voice that was chillingly familiar. It was the same smooth, deep tone he had heard from the man in the luxury car. Mr. Sullivan, I'm surprised you're still trying to change the course of things. You're quite persistent. David felt his pulse quick, a surge of anger rising in his chest. Who are you? What do you want from me? The man chuckled soft, the sound sending a chill down David's spine. What I want, Mr. Sullivan, is simple. I want you to stop meddling. You've been warned by your friend, by the girl, by everyone. Yet here you are, stubborn as ever. I'm offering you one last chance to walk away before things get complicated. David's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles turning white. He thought of Leo, of the desperate look in Sophie's eyes, and the feeling that everything he had built was on the verge of slipping away. He knew he couldn't back down, no matter the threats. I'm not going anywhere, David replied, his voice firm. If you think you can intimidate me into letting my friend ruin himself, you're mistaken. You might scare other people, but not me. There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment, David thought the man had hung up. But then the voice returned, colder than before. Very well, Mr. Sullivan. You've made your choice. Just Remember, you brought this on yourself. The line went dead, leaving David standing alone in the middle of the busy street, surrounded by the rush of passing cars and the distant hum of the city. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He had no idea what the man's threat meant, but he knew he couldn't afford to take it lightly. He had to act quickly, find a way to stop the signing before it was too late, and if he couldn't convince Leo, then he'd have to find another way to delay the deal. Desperation fueled his steps as he made his way back toward the Bellypock Cafe, hoping that Sophie might know something more, anything that could give him an edge. When he arrived at the cafe, the atmosphere inside was quieter than earlier, the morning rush having faded into the evening lull. He scanned the room, relieved when he spotted Sophie behind the counter, refilling the coffee pots. She looked up as he approached, her expression turning to surprise at the sight of him. "Mr. Sullivan," she said softly, setting down the pot. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you again." David wasted no time, leaning closer to keep their conversation private. "Sophie, I need your help. That man who's been following me, he just called me. He's threatening me, and I don't know what he's planning, but I can't let this deal go through, is there? Anything else you can tell me? Anything that might help me stop them?" Sophie's face paled, and she glanced around nervous, as if expecting to see the man lurking nearby. "He called you? That's bad, David, really bad. If he's making threats, then they're close to making their move, but there is something I didn't tell you earlier. I didn't think it would matter, but maybe it can help now." David leaned in closer, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Sophie hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There's a paper trail. It's not much, but I kept copies of a few documents. Records of meetings, some shady transfers. I stole them before I left, hoping I might use them one day to help someone like you. It's not enough to bring them down, but it could give you leverage. Maybe buy you some time." David's mind raced, a glimmer of hope piercing through the darkness. "Where are these documents?" She bit her lip, then glanced at the back of the cafe. "They're in a safe place, but I'll need time to get them. Meet me at the old train yard tonight. Midnight, it's quiet there and no one will be watching. I'll bring everything I have." David nodded, trying to keep his expression calm, even as fear twisted in his gut. "I'll be there, and Sophie, thank you. I don't know why you're risking this, but I'm grateful." She managed a small, sad smile. "Just be careful, Mr. Sullivan. You're not the first person I've tried to help, but I hope you'll be the first to make it out." David turned and left the cafe, his mind spinning with the urgency of the new plan. He didn't know if the documents Sophie mentioned would be enough, but it was his last chance to stop the disaster before it swallowed them both. As he walked through the darkening streets, the weight of the unknown pressed down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the night ahead would be a turning point, one that would decide everything. The city's lights flickered against the darkness as David made his way to the old train yard. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of distant rain, and the streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. He wrapped his jacket tighter around himself, feeling the chill seep into his bones as he neared the rusted gates of the abandoned yard. The train yard had once been a bustling hub of activity, but now it stood as a shadow of its former self, a graveyard of forgotten tracks and crumbling warehouses. Weeds poked through the cracks in the pavement, and the only sound was the distant wail of a train far outside the city. David slipped through a gap in the fence, his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he scanned the darkness for any sign of Sophie. He found her near a derelict boxcar, the moon casting a pale glow over her figure. She clutched a worn messenger bag to her chest, her face tight with anxiety as she spotted David approaching. He quickened his pace, relief washing over him at the sight of her. "You came," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Sophie nodded, glancing around as if expecting to see shadows moving among the rusted tracks. "We don't have much time. I managed to get the documents. It's all in here." She handed him the bag, her hands shaking. "Bank records, emails, a few contracts, enough to show that they're hiding something, but you need to be careful. If they find out you have this." "I know," David cut in, his voice firm. "I'll keep it safe, and I'll make sure they can't go through with their plan." For a moment, they stood in tense silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on. David could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a drumbeat of urgency, urging him to act. He looked down at the bag, then back up at Sophie, feeling a surge of gratitude toward the stranger who had risked so much to help him. "Thank you, Sophie," he said, his voice softening. "You've done more than enough. You should go before they realize you're involved." Sophie's eyes shone with unspoken fears, but she managed a small, determined nod. "You're right. I need to disappear for a while, but David, promise me you won't let them win. Don't let them destroy you like they've done to so many others." David met her gaze, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "I promise. I'll do whatever it takes. With that, Sophie turned and disappeared into the shadows of the train yard, leaving David alone with the messenger bag and a sense of impending danger. He clutched the bag tight, knowing it held the key to unraveling the web that had ensnared Leo and himself. As he turned to leave, the faint sound of an engine reached his ears. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, and quickly ducked behind the rusted boxcar. Through the gloom, he saw headlights cutting through the darkness, a sleek black car rolling to a stop near the entrance to the train yard. David's heart pounded as he watched a figure step out of the car, the shadows obscuring their features, but he recognized the silhouette, the smooth, deliberate movements of the man he had seen that morning, the one who had spoken to him from the luxury sedan. David pressed himself against the cold metal of the boxcar, clutching the messenger bag to his chest as he strained to hear their words. He couldn't make out much, just fragments of a low conversation, but it was enough to confirm his worst fears. "We need to find her and him. Make sure they don't leave with anything inconvenient." The voice was sharp, cutting through the night, and David felt a chill creep down his spine. He realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't just after the documents. Now, they were after him too. Adrenaline surged through his veins, and David knew he had to get out of the train yard before they spotted. He took a deep breath, glancing toward the far end of the yard, where the fence had a gap just wide enough to slip through. Clutching the bag tightly, he crouched low and began to move, keeping to the shadows as he crept along the length of the boxcar. The men's voices grew fainter as he put distance between, but he could still hear the threat that hung in the air, like a predator circling its prey. David's mind raced, calculating his next steps. He knew he had to find a safe place to stash the documents and figure out how to use them against the Vanguard group before it was too late. As he reached the gap in the fence, he slipped through and broke into a run, the bag thumping against his side. He didn't stop until he reached a more populated street, the glow of streetlights finally chasing away the shadows that had clung to him. He glanced back, half expecting to see the car's headlights follow, but the road behind him remained empty. He caught his breath and took stock of the situation. His next move had to be precise. He needed to find a safe place to hide the documents and a way to get through to Leo before the Vanguard group made their next move. He pulled out his phone and dialed the one person he hoped might still listen. "Leo, it's me. Listen, I don't have time to explain, but I've found something. Evidence that proves we're being set up. Meet me at the old warehouse on 8th Street in an hour. Alone. If you still trust me, you'll come." There was a tense pause on the other end, and David's heart sank as he imagined Leo ignoring the call, choosing to side with the shadows that had come between. But then, Leo's voice came through, wary but willing to listen. "Fine, David. 1 hour. This better not be another one of your wild theories." David let out a shaky breath of relief. "It's not, Leo. Just trust me. I'll explain everything when you get there." He ended the call, his hands still trembling, and tucked the phone back into his pocket. He knew that meeting Leo was a risk, one that could end with his friend turning against him completely. But it was a risk he had to take because he wasn't just fighting for their partnership anymore. He was fighting for their lives. With the messenger bag secured, David set off through the city streets, a single thought driving him forward. He had one last chance to save everything, and he couldn't afford to fail. David reached the old warehouse on 8th Street well before the appointed time, the place an echo of the train yard's desolation. Once, it had been a hub of industry, but now broken windows and crumbling walls were all that remained. A few streetlights cast a dull orange glow over the cracked pavement, and the hum of the city seemed distant, as if he had stepped into a forgotten corner of the world. He found a shadowed spot near the entrance and crouched down, clutching the messenger bag against his chest. His mind raced with 1,000 what-ifs. What if Leo refused to listen? What if the Vanguard group had already gotten to him? And worst of all, what if he had dragged Sophie into this, only for her warnings to go unheeded? Time dragged by, and every passing second made David more certain he was being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the sleek black car rounding the corner, but the street remained empty, silent except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed through the stillness. David tensed, his heart leaping into his throat, until he recognized Leo's familiar stride. His friend stepped into the dim light, his face drawn and shadowed. There was a wary, almost haunted look in his eyes, so different from the confident, ambitious man David had known for years. "You've got exactly 5 minutes, David," Leo said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth that had once characterized their friendship. "Tell me why I shouldn't just walk away." David rose from his hiding place, keeping his hands visible, the messenger bag slung over his shoulder. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the desperation in his voice. "Leo, I know you think I'm overreacting, but you have to believe me. There's more going on with this deal than you realize, Sophie. The waitress, she gave me these?" He pulled the bag forward, unzipping it and showing Leo the stack of documents inside. Records, bank transfers, proof that the Vanguard Group is setting us up. If you sign that contract, they'll take everything, and you'll be left with nothing but debts. Leo stared at the bag, his expression shifting through disbelief, confusion, and then a flicker of something like hope. For a moment, David thought he might reach for the documents. Might actually give him a chance. But then Leo's face hardened again, and he took a step back, shaking his head. Why should I believe you, David? You've been acting paranoid for weeks. Ever since that woman approached you, maybe you've just lost your edge, and now you're looking for excuses to back out. His voice cracked slightly, but he quickly recovered, crossing his arms over his chest. Or maybe you just can't handle the fact that I'm doing what's best. For both of us, David felt a surge of frustration, but he swallowed it back, trying to keep his voice calm. Leo, I know it's hard to hear this, but they've been playing us. You've changed, man. Ever since we got involved with these people, I didn't see it at first, but they've been pressuring you, making you feel like this deal is your only way out. They're using that against you. Leo's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment David thought his friend might actually swing at it, but then he let out a harsh, bitter laugh, turning his back on David and pacing away a few steps. You think you know everything, don't? Leo's voice came out strange, as if he were holding back a tidal wave of emotion. Well, here's the truth you never saw. I owe them. I borrowed money. More than I should have. When things were tight last year, the Vanguard Group offered me a way to cover our losses, to keep the business going while you were too busy dreaming about the future, and now they want it back. With interest, David's breath caught, the revelation hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had known things were tough last year, but he had never imagined that Leo had resorted to something so dangerous. Why didn't you tell me? We could have figured it out together. Found a way to pay them back without getting in deeper. Leo turned back, his face twisted with anger and shame. Because I was trying to protect you, David. You're the visionary, the guy with the big ideas. I'm the one who has to make sure we don't drown. And now I'm trapped. If I don't go through with this deal, they'll come after everything I have left. David's heart ached at the raw honesty in Leo's words. The pain that had driven his friend into such a desperate corner. He took a step closer, trying to convey the sincerity of his plea. It's not too late, Leo. We can still get out of this. Together, if we take these documents to the authorities, we might be able to stop them, but you have to trust me. Leo's face softened for a moment, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. David held his breath, hoping against hope that he had finally broken through. But then Leo's expression shifted, hardening once more, and he shook his head. I can't take that chance, David. If they find out I've betrayed them, it won't just be my money they'll take. They'll destroy my life, my family's life. David felt the last remnants of hope slip through his fingers. He reached out, desperation in his voice. Leo, please! But before he could finish, the warehouse door creaked open behind them. David spun around, his heart leaping into his throat as he saw two figures step inside, their silhouettes framed against the dim light. He recognized one of them immediately, the man from the luxury car, his face still hidden by shadows, but his presence unmistakably menacing. Well, isn't this touching? The man said, his voice dripping with mockery. Two old friends? Trying to sort out their differences. Shame it had to come to this. David moved to stand protectively in front of Leo, his pulse racing. What do you want? He demanded, his voice shaking with anger. If you think you can intimidate us, you're making a mistake. The man chuckled softly, the sound sending a chill through the air. I told you, Mr. Sullivan, that you should have walked away, but since you insist on playing the hero, I'm afraid we'll have to settle this another way. David's mind raced, the weight of the messenger bag pressing heavily against his side. He knew that the documents inside could be his only leverage, but now, faced with the cold threat of the man's presence, he realized just how precarious their situation had become. He glanced back at Leo, hoping for some sign of alliance, but his friend's face was a mask of fear and indecision. Leo, don't let them scare you, David said, his voice low but urgent. We can fight this together. But as the man in the shadows took a step closer, David saw the flicker of doubt in Leo's eyes, and he feared that it might already be too late. The air inside the warehouse seemed to grow colder, as if the darkness itself had thickened around them. David kept his eyes fixed on the man from the car, trying to mask the fear that twisted in his chest. He couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now, when everything hung in the balance. Leo stood a few steps behind him, his expression shifting between fear and uncertainty. David could see the struggle in his friend's eyes, the war between loyalty and self-preservation. He hoped against hope that Leo would find the courage to stand with him but the tension in the air suggested otherwise. The man from the car stepped forward, revealing more of his features in the dim light. He was tall, with sharp, angular features, and a cold smile that never reached his eyes. His companion, shorter and stockier, loomed silently behind him, his presence adding a layer of unspoken threat. "Mr. Sullivan, you've been causing us quite a bit of trouble," the man said smoothly, his gaze shifting between David and Leo. "All of this could have been avoided if you had simply accepted the terms. But now, well, you've left us with few options." David's pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stand tall. "You think you can scare us into signing your deal? It's not going to happen. I have evidence. Proof that you've been manipulating people like Leo. If anything happens to us, it'll come out." The man's smile widened slightly, as if amused by David's defiance. "Ah, yes. The documents. I must admit, you've been more resourceful than most. But let's not pretend that piece of paper will make a difference. The people I work for, they don't operate by the same rules you're used to." He took another step forward, and David saw the glint of something metallic beneath his coat. A gun, barely concealed but visible, enough to make the threat clear. David swallowed hard, the realization of how far they were willing to go settling over him like a shrapnel. "David, maybe we should just do what they say." Leo's voice broke the silence, shaky and filled with desperation. He took a step toward the man, his hands raised slightly as if in surrender. "Look, I'll sign whatever you want. Just leave him out of this." David felt a surge of betrayal twist in his gut, but he turned to Leo, his voice raw with urgency. "Leo, don't. They're not going to let us walk away, no matter what you do. If you give in now, you're giving up everything. Trust me, please." Leo's face crumpled, torn between the fear of losing everything he'd fought and the guilt of abandoning his friend. But the man from the car cut in before he could respond, his tone icy. "You see, Mr. Sullivan, even your own partner knows when he's beaten. I suggest you follow his example, unless you'd prefer things to get unpleasant." David's mind raced, searching for a way out, some advantage he could seize. He glanced at the messenger bag still slung over his shoulder, the weight of the evidence pressing against his side. If he could just get the documents to the authorities, or even make a scene that would draw attention to their situation, it might be enough to turn the tide. But as he weighed his options, the man's patience seemed to thin. He pulled the gun from beneath his coat, aiming it directly at David's chest. "Enough stalling. Give me the bag, and this can end quietly. Refuse, and I can't guarantee your safety or his." David's breath hitched, every muscle in his body tensing as he faced the cold barrel of the gun. He could feel Leo's eyes on him, the unspoken plea for survival hanging in the air between them. And in that moment, he realized that the only way to protect both of them was to take a gamble that might cost him everything. Slowly, David lifted the bag from his shoulder, holding it out as if in surrender. But just as the man reached for it, David spun on his heel, hurling the bag into the darkness of the warehouse. It landed with a heavy thud somewhere behind the rusted crates. Disappearing from view, the man cursed, his calm facade cracking for the first time as he raised the gun. "Higher, you idiot! Do you think this will save you?" But David wasn't listening. He threw himself at the man, using the element of surprise to knock him off balance. The gun went off with a deafening crack, the sound reverberating through the empty space as they grappled. David felt a searing pain in his shoulder, but he clung to the man's arm, twisting it with all his strength. Leo, frozen in shock, seemed to snap back into action at the sound of the gunshot! He lunged toward the stocky companion, grappling with him in a desperate struggle. David caught glimpses of the two of them wrestling for control, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. David gritted his teeth against the pain and managed to twist the gun free from the man's grip, sending it skidding across the floor. For a moment, he had the upper hand, but then the man delivered a sharp blow to his side, knocking the breath out of him. They both staggered, crashing into the stack of crates, and David felt his strength waning. But then he heard Leo shout, a desperate, guttural sound, and saw him managing to overpower the stocky man, pinning him against the ground. The sight gave David the burst of adrenaline he needed, and he swung with everything he had, landing a punch squarely across the man's jaw. The impact sent the man sprawling, dazed and breathless. David staggered back, clutching his bleeding shoulder, but he didn't let himself collapse. He turned to Leo, who was panting heavily, his eyes wide with fear and something else. Determination. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, David saw the glimmer of the old Leo, the friend he had believed in for so long. "We need to go, David," Leo gasped, glancing toward the shadowy depths of the warehouse where the bag had landed. "Before more of them come." David nodded, barely able to catch his breath, and together they stumbled toward the back exit. He felt the searing pain in his shoulder with every step, but he forced himself to push forward, clutching Leo's arm to keep them both steady as they burst out into the cold night air. David cast one last look back at the warehouse, the darkness swallowing the figures of their attackers. He knew this wasn't the end, not by a long shot, but as he and Leo vanished into the shadows of the city, he held on to the small, fragile hope that they had won themselves a chance to fight another day. David and Leo moved through the dark streets, their footsteps echoing off the damp pavement as they put as much distance as possible between themselves and the warehouse. David's shoulder throbbed with every jolt, each step sending sharp waves of pain through his body. He pressed a hand against the wound, feeling the warm, sticky flow of blood seep through his fingers. They slipped into a narrow alleyway, hidden between two rundown buildings, and David leaned heavily against a brick wall, gasping for breath. Leo hovered nearby, glancing back down the alley as if expecting their pursuers to emerge from the darkness at any moment. "You're hurt," Leo said, his voice raw with panic. He dropped to one knee beside David, trying to inspect the wound, but his hands were shaking too much to be of any use. "We need to get you to a hospital." David shook his head, forcing himself to stay alert despite the pain clouding his thoughts. "We can't go to a hospital, Leo. They'll be looking for us there. We need to lay low until we figure out what to do with those documents." Leo pressed a hand to his forehead, his expression tight with guilt and frustration. "This is all my fault. If I had just listened to you sooner." "No," David interrupted, his voice hoarse, but firm. "We don't have time for regrets right now. What matters is that you came through back there. You didn't let them win, and that's what's going to save us." Leo stared at him, the weight of David's words sinking in. For the first time in days, he seemed to shed the shadow of desperation that had clung to him. He gave a small, determined nod, and David felt the flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this together. They stayed hidden in the alley for a few more minutes, catching their breath and trying to form a plan. David's mind raced through their options, knowing that every second they remained exposed was another second for the Vanguard group to close in on them. They needed a place to regroup, somewhere they could stash the documents and plan their next move without being found. "There's a motel a few blocks from here," Leo said after a moment, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Not the safest, but it's quiet, off the main roads. We can hide out there until morning." David nodded, clenching his jaw against the pane. "Lead the way." With Leo supporting him, they made their way through the back streets, avoiding the main roads and keeping to the shadows. The city's neon lights flickered above them, casting distorted reflections on the wet pavement. David's vision blurred at the edges, the blood loss making him feel lightheaded, but he forced himself to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the rundown motel, its neon sign buzzing weakly in the night. Leo slipped inside to handle the check-in, and David leaned against a nearby lamppost, struggling to stay conscious. The events of the night played over and over in his mind. Sophie's warnings, the fight in the warehouse, the documents hidden somewhere. In the darkness, it all seemed like a blur, a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. When Leo returned with the room key, he helped David inside, guiding him down a dimly lit hallway to a small, musty room. The bed was creaky, the curtains stained, but it was a place to hide. At least for now. David collapsed onto the bed, wincing as pain shot through his injured shoulder. He watched as Leo fumbled with a first aid kit he had found in the motel bath, his hands still trembling. "I'm not a doctor, but I'll do my best," Leo muttered, kneeling beside David. He cleaned the wound as best as he could, bandaging it tightly to stop the bleeding. David clenched his teeth against the sting, his vision swimming with each move. "Thanks, Leo," David managed, his voice strained. "We need to find those documents. They're our only chance." Leo nodded, his expression grim. "I'll go back to the warehouse as soon as it's safe, but we need to rest, regroup. We can't fight them if we're falling apart." David closed his eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion wash over him. He knew Leo was right. They couldn't keep running on sheer desperation. But as he drifted between consciousness and sleep, a darker thought nagged at the back of his mind. Would they even survive long enough to get those documents back? David woke to the gray light of dawn seeping through thin motel curtains, his body aching with the after effects of the night's events. His shoulder throbbed beneath the hastily applied bandages, but he forced himself to sit up, the urgency of their situation banishing any thoughts of rest. Across the room, Leo sat slumped in a chair, staring out the window, his face pale and drawn. David's voice was rough as he broke the silence. "We don't have much time, Leo. They know about us. They'll be searching the city by now." Leo turned, meeting David's gaze with a mix of determination and guilt. "I'll go back to the warehouse, get the bag, but we need a plan for what happens after. If we get those documents, How do we use them? David thought for a moment, wincing as he shifted his weight on the bed. Archer might be our best bet. He said he had connections, people who could help expose the Vanguard group. If we can get the documents to him, he might be able to get us the protection we need. Leo nodded slowly, his expression grim. All right, I'll get the bag. You stay here. Lay low. I'll be back as soon as I can. David watched as Leo grabbed his jacket and slipped out the door, a tight knot of anxiety twisting in his gut. He wanted to trust his friend, to believe that Leo would come back with the evidence they needed to turn the tide. But there was a part of him that couldn't shake the fear. Fear that Leo might run, or that he might be caught before he could return. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching into eternity, as David waited in the cramped motel room, every creak of the building making his heart race. He tried to focus on the plan, on what they would do once they had the documents in hand, but doubt clawed at it, threatening to unravel what little hope remained. After what felt like an hour, the door creaked open, and Leo slipped back inside. His face flushed with exertion, he held the messenger bag close to his chest, his breaths coming fast and shallow. I got it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They were still looking for us near the warehouse, but I managed to sneak in through the back. Here, it's all here. He placed the bag on the bed beside David, and they quickly sifted through the papers, bank statements, emails, contracts. All of it pointed to the Vanguard Group's schemes, hidden within layers of legalese that would unravel if examined closely. David's hands trembled as he held the documents, a spark of hope flickering to life. We have to get this to Archer now, David said, glancing at the door as if expecting their pursuers to burst through at any moment. He'll know what to do with this. He might even be able to get us into witness protection until this all blows over. Leo hesitated, his eyes darting to the bag, then back to David. And if they come after us before we reach him? David forced a grim smile. Then we fight like hell. Together, they left the motel room, moving quickly through the early morning streets, keeping to side alleys to avoid being seen. David's shoulder burned with every movement, but he pushed through the pain, knowing that the documents in the bag were their only chance at escaping the nightmare that had overtaken their lives. They reached Archer's office just as the city began to wake, the streets filling with the early rush of commuters. Leo kept watch outside while David slipped through the door, the bell chiming softly above his head. Archer looked up from his desk, surprise flashing across his weary face when he saw David enter. You again? Archer said, his tone a mix of curiosity and concern. I heard about the commotion last night. You're lucky to be standing, Mr. Sullivan. David dropped the bag on Archer's desk, the paper spilling out for emphasis. We got the evidence, everything you need to bring them down, but they're after us, and we need your help. Archer's eyes widened as he scanned the documents, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. He glanced up at David, then nodded slowly. This might be enough, but you're right. They'll be coming for you, if you want any chance of making it through this. You'll need to go into hiding while I take this to the right people. David felt a surge of relief wash over him, but before he could respond, the door to the office flew open, slamming against the wall. He spun around to see the man from the luxury car standing in the doorway, his cold smile returning as he aimed a gun directly at David's chest. You really should have stayed down, Mr. Sullivan, the man said, his voice dripping with menace. Now I'm afraid this ends here. Time seemed to slow as David's mind raced, adrenaline surging through his veins. He saw Archer reaching for something under his desk, Leo shouting from outside, but the man's finger was already tightening on the trigger. Without thinking, David lunged forward, slamming into the man just as the gun went off. The shot rang out, deafening in the small space, but the bullet went wide, shattering a window. They crashed to the ground. Grappling for control, but David's injured shoulder gave out, sending a fresh wave of pain through him. Before the man could regain the upper hand, Leo burst into the room, tackling him from behind. The gun clattered to the floor, and David scrambled to his feet, grabbing the weapon and aiming it at their attacker. Don't move! David shouted, his hands shaking. Leo stood beside his chest, blood smeared on his temple from the struggle. Archer emerged from behind his desk, a phone in hand. I've already called the police. They'll be here any moment. The man's face twisted into a snarl, but he stayed still, his eyes darting between the three of them. You think this ends with me? You have no idea who you're up against. My employers won't rest until you're ruined. David's grip on the gun tightened, but he forced himself to keep his focus. Let them come. We have the truth now, and I'm not afraid of them anymore. Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the air, and the police stormed into the office, dragging the man to his feet and reading him his rights. David watched as they hauled him away, the weight of the past few days finally beginning to lift. As the officers took statements and bagged the evidence, Archer placed a hand on David's uninjured shoulder. You did well, Mr. Sullivan. You and your friend might just have a chance. After all, David glanced at Leo, who stood nearby, looking bruised and exhausted but alive. For the first time in days, David allowed himself a small, genuine smile. We're not out of the woods yet, but we'll make it together. Leo met his gaze, and for a moment, the shadows of the past seemed to lift. There was still a long road ahead, but they had faced down the darkness, and they were still standing, the aftermath of the confrontation at Archer's office felt like a whirlwind. The police secured the evidence, hauling away the man from the Vanguard, his threats fading into the noise of sirens and police radios. David and Leo, bruised but resolute, watched from the sidelines as their lives were packed into evidence bags and statements, each document a piece of the truth they had fought so hard to uncover. By the time the sun fully rose, the city was waking up to a new day. But for David and Leo, it felt like the end of an era. They stood outside Archer's office, the morning air crisp against their skin, both of them feeling the weight of what they had survived and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Archer approached them, a folder tucked under his arm. He had a weary but relieved expression, the kind that spoke of battles fought and narrowly won. "You've done your part," he said, handing the folder to David. "In here is everything the authorities need to launch an investigation into the Vanguard Group's operations. It won't be easy, but you've given them the leverage they need." David accepted the folder, clutching it tight. He glanced at Leo, who looked more like himself than he had in months, worn out but with a spark of determination in his eyes. "What happens now?" Leo asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. Archer offered a small, reassuring smile. "For you two, it means keep your heads down while the investigation takes its course. It'll be a bumpy ride, but I think you'll come out the other side in one piece." He paused, then added, "There might even be a chance to rebuild once the dust settles." David felt a lump rise in his throat at the thought of starting over. It would be hard, harder than anything they had faced so far, but there was hope in it too. A chance to redefine themselves outside of the shadows that had nearly consumed them. "Thank you, Archer," David said quietly, shaking the man's hand. "For everything." Archer nodded, slipping back into his office with a parting nod, and then, for the first time in days, David and Leo found themselves standing alone, the future stretching out before them like an uncharted road. They walked together down the sidewalk, the noise of the city growing around them, blending with the early morning bustle. Leo broke the silence. First, his voice tentative. "You know, I never thought we'd make it through that. I didn't think I deserved to." David turned to his friend. Seeing the weight of guilt still lingering in Leo's eyes, he clapped a hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "You made mistakes, Leo. So did I. But we got through it because, in the end, we didn't give up on each other. That has to count for something." Leo nodded slowly, a flicker of hope returning to his face. "Yeah, I guess it does. So, what now? Do we try to salvage the business? Start over?" David considered the question as they continued walking, the city unfolding around them like a blank slate. He thought of everything they had been through, the risks, the losses, the betrayals, and then he thought of the second chance they had earned, hard-fought and precious. "I think we start fresh," David said finally, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. "No shortcuts, no deals with devils, just us doing things the right way this time." Leo managed a weak laugh, but it was genuine. The kind of laugh David hadn't heard from him in far too long. "Yeah, I think I can live with that." They walked on, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into the uncertain but promising light of a new beginning. There would be challenges ahead. Questions from the authorities, the slow process of rebuilding trust, and the scars that would take time to heal. But as they moved forward, side by side, they carried with them the knowledge that they had faced the worst together and come out on the other side stronger than before. As the sun rose higher over the city, they disappeared into the flow of morning commuters. Two figures among many, but now with a renewed sense of purpose and the promise of a better tomorrow, guiding their way. Epilogue. A year later, the small office on the corner of 7th and Maple was nothing like their old headquarters. It was humbler, the furniture secondhand, the walls still bare, but it was theirs. A space where David and Leo could start over, free from the shadows that had nearly consumed them. They had renamed their company, rebranded, and faced the long road of rebuilding from scratch. David stood by the window, looking out at the city that had nearly swallowed him whole, but had ultimately given him a chance to fight back. Behind him, Leo was on a call with a new client. Nothing big, but it was honest work, free from the weight of past mistakes. The investigation into the Vanguard Group had taken time, but the authorities had made progress. Arrests had been made, including some of the people who had orchestrated the scheme that nearly destroyed their lives. Archer had kept them updated throughout the process, And though the fight wasn't over, David had learned to find peace in small victories. He turned back to his desk, catching Leo's eye as his friend hung up the phone. Leo offered him a grin, the kind that reminded David of when they were just two kids with big dreams and nothing to lose. "How about we grab lunch?" "My treat," Leo said, leaning back in his chair. David chuckled, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. "Sure, let's take a break. We deserve it." As they left the office, stepping into the bright afternoon sun, David felt a sense of calm settle over him. They had faced their darkest moments and found their way back to the light. And now, for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem like something to fear. It seemed like a promise waiting to be fulfilled.